Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Eureka, California. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. If there was only one person to trust in the study of UFOs, UAPs, and NHI right now, someone who understands the complexities involved, the nuance and magic, the tragedies of disinformation and historic abuse, as well as the need in this moment for a new approach and fresh thinking, our guest today would rank near the top of any good list. It's not just me. Over the past several years, Kelly Chase has become a recognized authority on this slippery subject as a scholar and student, a writer and podcaster, but also as an experiencer. Her recent series, Cosmosis, UFOs and a New Reality, which she put together with production partner J. Christopher King and others, represents a new benchmark in such projects. It revels in all the paradoxical nuance, invites people to engage in the relevant questions without making up their minds, and raises the tenor of the overall discussion by advocating for wonder, inclusivity, and broadened human potential. Anyone interested in these discussions should absolutely search the series out on Amazon or Apple or wherever and take the 3 hours to watch and ultimately understand where these questions are leading us as a species. While Kelly has been an important, prominent voice these past few years, I suspect that many people still aren't really hearing some of the subtleties in what she has to say. Her insights are sometimes subversive to the traditional ufological approach, courageously so. We're all being asked to consider the following. What is important about this subject? What are the long-term goals? Who should we trust moving forward? And what does it all say about our species and, more importantly, our governmental institutions? In particular, we have to wonder if our demand and expectations for disclosure from a system that dreads the power often lying latent in each of our minds are doomed to frustration. If so, what is success in this quest without a governmental mea culpa? It's an honor to once again have Kelly Chase on the show. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, James. That was such a kind intro. I appreciate that.
Kind but well deserved. You do great work, and I thank you for that. It helps guide me through what I'm doing, and a lot of the people that I work with, we're all huge fans. So
Oh,
just to get
thank
that
you.
out of the way. Okay, so Cosmosis, I loved it. There's a couple subtle PBS illusions in there that
Yes.
people were watching, sort of the cartoon graphics, which I totally dug. Being a child of PBS myself. But to sort of start broadly, I mean, what do you think was the mission setting out in developing this series, and how do you feel like you did in accomplishing that with season one?
Well, I love that you appreciated the little nod to PBS. Jay and I are both huge fans of kind of like 70s, 80s PBS broadcasting, and that was kind of a touchstone for us aesthetically. But yeah, I mean, our goal was to create the thing that we wanted to exist. Um, we obviously there's been some great media that's been put out in this space over the last few years, but I think in terms of telling the story of, hey, there might be something going on here, I think we've nailed it. Like it has been done. It's been done several times. It's been done well. But, Jay and I both have private communities that we run. He runs the Experiencer group, and I have my private UFO Rabbit Hole Patreon community. And we're constantly in conversations with those communities. And what we really saw through the work that we were doing in that way was that the questions that people have, like when I have these monthly calls with my patrons, they can come and ask me anything. And what I noticed really quickly was that people weren't asking me the things I thought they were going to ask me. They weren't like, hey, what's up with crypto terrestrials? Or like, what do you think about this particular case? The questions that they had were, how do I live my life now that I know that this is true? Like, what does this mean about the nature of our reality? How do I navigate, being someone who is now sort of living outside of consensus reality, but still has to like go to work inside of consensus reality?
Mhm.
Um, how do we know what we know? How do we know what's true? And also, the deeper aspects of the UAP phenomenon that's like not being talked about. Although until very recently, I was very excited over this last weekend to see Jake Barber in, that explosive report with Ross Coulthart talking about the emotional impact of being in close contact to one of these anomalous beings or craft or whatever it is. That's not something we've seen much of. And so we really wanted to create something that took the conversation to that next step. A lot of stuff that you watch is like ask the questions like, are UFOs real? And then at the end, it's like, I don't know, maybe. And we wanted to start at UFOs are real. What does that mean about the nature of our reality, about our relationship to authority, authority structures and legacy institutions? What does that mean about who we are as human beings? And that was really what we set out to do. And I'm always my biggest critic, but I'm really proud of where we landed with Cosmosis. I think we achieved what we set out to.
Yeah. No, you mentioned prior to starting that there is probably going to be a season two, or there most definitely is going to be one. What terrain do you think that you want to move into with another part? Is there some, aspect that you think that you've left on the table, or are you going to get deeper with the things that you've already kind of opened up?
I think we're mostly going to get deeper with the things that we've already opened up. I think that the two big questions that are most exciting to us, and I think also the most kind of avoided in the more traditional disclosure narrative, is who are they? Like, who are they? We spend so much time talking about the craft that they allegedly potentially could be flying around, and we don't actually know that that's what those even are. We don't know that those are vehicles.
Yeah.
But who are they? What is the intelligence behind this phenomenon? And also then who are we? Because our relationship to them seems to imply that we don't have the full scope of an understanding of what our reality is, who we are, what we're doing here. And if you really look, as we kind of teased out a little bit in the first season, if you look at the people who have been in this field from the very beginning, the people who are still doing the podcast circuits now, the people whose faces you'll still see occasionally on a podcast, like they all got into this and they all know each other from decades ago from being involved in things like Project Stargate and programs within our government that were specifically looking at human potential. If you look at their histories, the money they invest, the people they hang out with, the things that seem most interesting to them, it's near-death experiences, it's psi phenomena, and it's even like the nature of the soul. It's that sort of, those are the questions that those people are asking, and UFOs seem to be almost like an afterthought or, you know, uh, just like one little branch of this much larger field of study. And so I think that's where we really would like to go next.
That's interesting because from my own perspective and my own approach, it's been to assume that all of that is true. The UFO stuff is true, and all of the other things that people talk about, NDEs, whatever that is, and get to, well, what does reality look like if all those things are happening? And it basically, I mean, to my mind, a lot of it settles out with materialism is a broken, mistaken approach to what reality is, and there's something a lot deeper and more meaningful going on, and potentially we're wired into that naturally, whether it's, consciousness is prevalent throughout the universe or it's all consciousness. I mean, sort of a Donald Hoffman kind of idea, or Bernardo Kastrup. But those, to me, are the important questions. And it seems like there's a ripple effect going on. I mean, the UFO topic has come to the surface, but there's also a lot of progress being made in a lot of these other discussions where, I mean, like quantum physics, if we had ever taken that seriously from the beginning and actually grokked what the implications were, I think could have had these discussions a long time ago. Um, but we haven't. And so the progress we've made in quantum physics has gone to back up sort of this narrative that we live in a material universe, even though that's not the premise of what's, the theories are saying in quantum physics. So yeah, I think that that's the most one of the most important, discussions, and the human potential part, especially. I liked how you guys sort of focused in on that in the series, and to my mind, I think our potential is limitless, and I don't know. Um, I think it's our duty, sort of, or our responsibility as human beings these days, to kind of begin our own personal search for what our potentials are and how we can connect to things, and given where we're at psychologically with politics and everything else, it seems like it's kind of the answer to a lot of what ails us at the moment as well.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think there's so many things that we can take from this movement that could potentially be healing. The obviously like what you're talking about, the recognition that we are more than just our physical bodies, that there's more to this place where we find ourselves, and there's more to ourselves, and there's more to everything than we thought. And I think that's really fantastic because it's a relief, as opposed to the idea that we're all just sort of these like animated meat puppets that somehow sprung up out of the nothing into nothing we shall return.
Yeah.
I think that's a hard way to live. That's a big burden to bear, and I think reconnecting to the reality of what we are as a human is a really special thing. And I think the other thing that can be really healing for us potentially is intellectual humility.
Yes,
We
yes, yes.
we live in this culture where everybody just feels like they've got everything figured out.
Yeah.
If gas prices spike, everybody on the internet is suddenly an expert on how gas prices are set and whose fault this is and whose head should roll over it. And they're not willing to consider any other pieces of evidence. And then the next day they're on to the next thing they were told to be mad about. And there's an expert on that all of a sudden. And I think that like getting back to a place where our ideas are something that are always up for debate, that we're always exploring, that we're not just kind of like settling on this like pre-packaged set of ideas. Like if you're blue, you believe this. If you're red, you believe this, and like never. And it's a moral and intellectual failing to even consider another perspective. Like that's where most of our culture is right now. And I think that when you realize with UFOs how different reality actually is, that really becomes difficult to be that certain ever again about anything. And I think that actually is helpful.
Now, one of the things I really appreciated about the Cosmosis, I mean, I'm a fan of James Madden, just like you are, and he brings a level of insight and new thinking to the discussion that I think is really, really important. And one of the things that he brought up first in the documentary series was about hyperobjects, the idea that there are kind of entities that are constructed, sort of abstract entities that basically function as full-on, kind of, I don't know how you describe it, full-on sort of living creatures in a way, metaphysically anyway. And the UFO may represent, some of that. And he uses the example of the pizza restaurant that you could, swap out all the parts and it's got its own mission and it does, its own work and can survive the interchanging of all of its parts. And it struck me hearing him talk about it that like we do a lot of constructing of these hyper objects and they take on, like he said, kind of a mission of their own. And it struck me that, I mean, you could make a long list of these things like ufology is a hyper object or the intelligence community is a hyper object, the national security state, and we have basically populated our metaphysical universe with demons in some sense, with these creatures that have, like, if you're a corporation and your number one requirement legally is that you produce profit for your shareholders, then you are a consumer and that is all that's important to you. So you don't sort of have the value structure that we would expect a being in our like social group to have. And so that could ultimately be damaging to the overall body politic. It just really makes you consider the mission that you set forth and anything you get involved in, and how we all have to be cognizant of what the outcomes might be with those things and what we're unleashing into the world. And I think that that's something we can usefully look at with, like I said, ufology or any of these subjects, that we have to be careful about, these automatons that we're kind of programming and releasing into the ether, to make sure that the impacts that, redound to us are ultimately positive.
Yeah, no, I love James Madden, and I love that example, the way that you put that about, how a lot of these things do end up being demonic, like a corporation, something that is entirely set up to extract resources and maximize profit, behaves more like a demon or a virus than
Yeah,
like any kind of a human or a moral agent. And yet we don't have a lot of control over those things. They seem to control us more than we control
exactly.
them,
Yeah, yeah.
especially, with the campaign finance laws being such as they are.
And money
We're
equaling free
treating,
speech and all
right? We're treating
that.
corporations like they're people, but they're not people. They're something else. And I think that we're surrounded by hyper objects, especially, I think the 20th century was probably the place where the hyperobject, probably the century of the hyperobject, right? Where certainly they existed before, but the proliferation of man-made hyperobjects was kind of off the charts. And it seems like in the midst of all of that, we may have bumped up against some other hyperobjects that we didn't know were there. And now we're aware of kind of a level of coherency um and struggle that exists kind of like above where we are, and things that like we can only kind of approach indirectly.
Yeah. And it seems like, I mean, since maybe we share the environment, those hyperobjects are taking notice of what we've created and are like, no, I mean, we have to go to the root and maybe, reshape the thinking of these, little meat puppets down on planet Earth so that they create something more positive, or let go some of these hyperobjects that they've been promulgating. And the series goes on to talk about the intelligence community. And I'm torn. I mean, I've been doing this for a while now, and it's like on one hand, we're all, and you address this, that we're all kind of waiting with bated breath for the next dribble to come out from someone who is either currently with the intelligence community or formerly with the intelligence community, even though they say no one's ever really a former
Right.
intelligence operator. And so we're all waiting for revelations from a group of people that we can't really take at face value, no matter what we're hearing from them. And so your whole point about like not, you know, having the goal be disclosure from the government, but make this something about our own personal explorations of human potential, I think is really, really vital for this to become, the kind of pursuit that will be ultimately socially revolutionary. I mean, if we can use this as a way to reinvent who we are as a species or how we interact with each other, that's great. And we don't need the technology necessarily to do that. We can do that internally. And if, the technology is a real thing and it comes out and that helps, great. But we're not, sitting around waiting through the manipulations to kind of get to it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think something that the community talks a lot about Carl Nell's talk at Soul, the first Soul.
Yeah.
Um, and like people refer to it all the time. And yet it's really interesting to me how little what he said has seemed to be integrated by the people who talk about it into their
Yeah.
worldview of what's going on. Because, Carl Nell, if anybody hasn't seen that talk, it's available online on the Soul Foundation's YouTube channel. And it's really worth watching because here is Carl Nell is one of the highest ranking military intelligence people who have stepped forward to speak on this subject. And in that talk, what he was basically saying was that, that they have considered whether or not to disclose in the past. They decided not to, that like that there are reasons that they're choosing to disclose now, and that it's ultimately a hedge against other risks that have grown to the point that they feel are worth mitigating and like maybe essential to mitigate. Um, that there seems to be something coming, or whether it's disclosure from another nation who's perhaps gotten further with this, or even disclosure from NHI itself, which could always be a possibility that they've had to like move forward with this and starting to like get it out into the world. But it's on a long timeline. Like everybody's waiting for this breakthrough, but like Carl Nell's timeline is like 15 years long or something like that. And that's just get to the point where we're kind of openly acknowledging contact. And so, it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing or that those people are evil and nefarious. That's how we set that whole part of our government up. That's what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be like analyzing risks and trying to keep us safe. And if they don't know the outcome of something, um, they're not going to do it because like
Yeah.
the amount of risk is too high. And like I think for most of the problems we're getting them to solve, that's probably the right answer. But I've also started to realize that like based on how all of that works and how they approach that kind of information, like just as a for instance, I think that if we had made contact, and maybe we have already, with some sort of like alien civilization on another planet, or had some sort of proof of that, I actually don't think they'd tell us. I
No.
really, I don't think
Yeah.
they would.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that they would make a cost benefit analysis. And if they felt like it was in the long-term interest of the nation state to tell us, they'd tell us, but they have no interest in just being, open with that kind of information. They're always going to analyze anything they're dealing with in that lens of whether or not it furthers their mission,
Right.
and that's kind of gross. I know it's necessary, but I also think that maybe we've moved too far in that direction. And people talk about how we brushed up against the Nazis in World War II and kind of adopted some of their intelligence practices and even some of their operators into our intelligence networks. and maybe that was like a vector for kind of infection or something, that like this fascistic idea about how to relate to your own people. And I'm not saying that all intelligence people are fascists, and I don't mean to be that harsh about it. But I do think that there is a very anti-democratic spirit to some of the secret keeping. And like if we did make contact, I believe it's like Jay said in the documentary, it's an inalienable human right that we know certain things about the nature of our reality. And if they're keeping that secret, then they are, I mean, the level of betrayal there is hard to overstate. It's like you're basically allowing everyone to live in some kind of a false sense of what's real to benefit the government. And that's like kind of dystopian, you know? I don't know how else to say it.
No, it is. And I think that there are a lot of realities that are self-evident when you get into this topic that the community itself isn't ready to talk about, including that one. People can really talk about Carl Nell's talk and then not look to the people who are like with the information that we're getting from the people who are at the forefront of the disclosure movement. These are intelligence people, these are counterintelligence people, these are people who basically almost all of them still hold clearances. Basically, almost all of them either work directly for the DoD or they work in some sort of like capacity as a contractor. And everything that they've told us is what has been cleared for them in their DOPSR. And like once again, I'm not trying to attack anybody. This is the job that we have given them to do. But
Yeah,
like it's pretty clear if you take Carl Nell seriously, and I think that we should, that what we're seeing now with disclosure is to at least a certain extent being orchestrated towards very specific aims. And those aims are not transparency. Those aims are like giving people enough information so that society doesn't collapse if something does happen that ends up revealing like
yeah,
some version of catastrophic disclosure happens, that like society is not going to entirely collapse and that they are going to be able to maintain control. Those are the things that they're solving for in that equation. And once
yeah.
again, it doesn't mean everybody's evil or nefarious. We need these people doing this kind of work, but to take it all then so seriously and to like believe every bit of it as people who should be more educated on like how the sausage is made is very confusing to me.
Yeah. And I mean, that in that direction, it's also like there are people out there who are, I get irritated by people who are like, oh, he's an intelligence operative, and they're just really dismissive or mean about it. I think that maybe the point realizing that they have a purpose to serve and that they are working for something that benefits all of us in terms of the government, we can be a little bit more forgiving about some of that manipulation, or I don't know how to put it, but like people who are really, really rabidly anti-Lou or whatever. It's
Hmm.
like I get what you're saying, but he's also leading this conversation in a way that is making progress. And as long as we enjoy that progress, let's not attack him and let's let this process play forward. And on the converse end of that, there's also the hero worship that goes on with some of these guys, where it's like, oh, they are doing this out of some sort of generosity of spirit, and I don't know that that's true either. I think maybe we just need to remember that they're human beings and that they're serving a role in whatever systems they're in. I don't know.
I
It's
completely
complex,
agree.
Yeah,
No, I completely agree. And I mean, it is serving a purpose. It's clear that most of our civilization is not ready to have this conversation yet. And so having these things trickle out over years, as frustrating as it can be, probably, I will grudgingly say that I think that that probably is the, maybe, I guess I won't say I think it's the best approach, but like I can understand the risk mitigation of it. I can,
sure,
you know,
yeah,
I can get behind the thought process. But I just think that like if we're looking to that narrative, like I support disclosure. I believe disclosure should happen. I think it's of historic importance, but I don't believe in disclosure as in the narrative as it's being presented. I don't believe it.
hmm,
And it's okay. I'm not worried. I'm not trying to tear that narrative down. I think that narrative is actually serving a certain purpose. But for people who are more serious about this and want to talk about what's really going on, I think you almost can't. It's not just that you shouldn't look to those people, it's that, like, to make any progress, you really can't. We have to understand that, like, for these giant black budget programs, they usually have 6 to 7 times the amount of the budget for the program itself just for security. And so I think people really underestimate how far they go
yeah,
and how
yeah,
many
yeah,
people are involved and like the elaborate stories that get woven. And I think there's like an event horizon around the secrecy, like the government secrecy, where if you get too close to it, at some point you cross a line that you didn't even know that you were crossing when you crossed it, and now you're in the Hall of Mirrors.
Yeah.
Now you're in the game, but the game is set up that there's no way for you to win. Like there's no way out, and it only once you get past that event horizon, the phenomenon itself becomes less and less clear. Like what is actually going on becomes less and less clear, and that's the way that it's set up because they
Yeah.
don't they're smart. They know what they're doing. But all we have to do is just circumvent it. We just have to like literally step around that narrative and start to form groups and communities around the of citizens who want to explore this stuff on our own and say, yes, we recognize the secrecy is happening. That's not the most important thing that's happening here. And what we
Yeah.
want to talk about is not the personalities and the palace intrigue and the blah, blah, blah. We want to talk about the phenomenon itself. What is it? How does it work? What does it mean? Like those are the things. And I think we can absolutely do that. But the best way to do that is to kind of like just step away from the disclosure narrative as it exists and to start looking at things through other lenses.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the documentary, you talk about like Diana Pasulka's protocols, and I mean, there's a long list of ways that people have developed to kind of engage with the subject and the and NHI and whatnot. And I think that kind of like you said, building and joining communities that are doing that kind of work is absolutely pivotal. The one problem I see is that it's the intelligence information that we're talking about has infiltrated every
Yes.
aspect of this. It's like Hal Puthoff. I mean, someone was talking to me once about like if Hal Puthoff was lying, so much of what we talk about in the UFO community it just collapses. I don't think Hal is, and I think that there's scientific evidence through a lot of people that confirm a lot of what he's saying. So I'm not trying to denigrate him, but there are a few people who are involved in the intelligence community that have brought forward a lot of information, and a lot of that fuels a lot of what we talk about and dig into. And so there's just it's so rife with all of that information. It's going to be a an interesting challenge to figure out how we can back up and kind of approach this topic from a more organic, human kind of way. And I think Jeff Kripal is someone that we can look to kind of begin to think about that kind of stuff. He certainly doesn't buy into a lot of narratives, but he doesn't dismiss a lot of narratives, and I think that that's a really useful way to approach this stuff. Um,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Jeff Kripal was a consulting producer for us on Cosmosis, which was actually just an absolute honor. Jay and I in particular, are just like huge, huge Kripal fans and have read everything he's written. And so, having his involvement, and you can definitely, I think for people who know Jeff's work, you can kind of see his thumbprint on the show for sure.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, just a couple of points, random points. I've got some notes here from the show that I just wanted to mention to you. I thought it was a great point about Arrow's investment, like Arrow, right? I mean, talking about how that is sort of another blue book incarnation, another instance of that sort of behavior. And then you mentioned that they spent way more money on the perception management part of their mission than on this really touted study that they were doing with NASA, which only got 100,000, just to give a sense of what the various value system is that they're using. It's like all of this is so massaged, and it's terrible. But the interesting thing about the news story with like you mentioned before with Jake Barber is that like the threat narrative is often associated with some of these military types, and that's not what he's doing. Like he is straight up like I mean he was like I think NHI is there for our benefit. He was like in tears talking about how beautiful his contact experience was, and I thought that that was a beautiful complication to the story and really helped me like believe what he was saying. It wasn't just sort of the typical thing that you might expect from a manipulative source. So I tend to give him more credit because of it.
Yeah, I that really struck me as well. I think that, as being an experiencer myself, I really identified with like the exact things that he was talking about. And
Yeah.
I've heard from so many other people who have experienced the same, which isn't to say that like I totally discredit the threat narrative. Like some people are like once again, I think we have
Love
to
and
have
light
nuance
kind of
with all of these
yeah.
things.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because like there's definitely like bad things have happened to people as a result of encounters with UFOs and UAPs, but the part that we don't hear almost ever is the people who have like the a situation like what Jake Barber described, or many other people, or someone like me even, where you have this like overwhelmingly positive experience that like sets your life on a new direction, that gives you a sense of purpose, that makes you feel as though you're being guided and protected, and that like you're on a mission, I guess. And that stuff can sound really off-putting to people who are kind of haven't had an experience like that themselves, because you're like, oh my gosh, is this person crazy? Are they getting a messiah complex? Like, what's going on
They're
here?
brainwashed or whatever. Yeah, yeah. It's like,
Right.
yeah.
And I'm open to all of that also, by the way. You know what I mean? Like no one's more skeptical of my own experience or thoughts than I am. But we have to at least talk about that stuff, because if we're not going to be able to get to the bottom of what it is and what's causing that response in people if we just ignore it. We can't just take the data points that are convenient and easy for us. We have to especially look at the data points that don't make sense.
Intersection between like the soul and religion and this topic, I think, is really interesting and really complex. I mean, people, for instance, who are really, really skeptical of the whole idea think that, they point to this sort of nascent UFO religion that they say is emerging, and they say that there's believers that have infested the Pentagon, and they're the ones pushing this narrative. And then they point at the sort of the woo as evidence of like the new emerging theology or dogma or whatever. And so it's really touchy to have those discussions in the kind of way that doesn't come off like you're proselytizing or pushing some sort of revelation like that. But it is intrinsically a part of what everyone's experiencing, so we have to talk about it. And that's how do we navigate that? How do you think that we should do both, like address people's concerns about the religiosity, but then also deal with the phenomenon on its own terms?
I think that's a great question. I think that, for one, I think we need to make a place in scientific conversations for religion, and we need in religious conversations to make room for science. I think that like these two worldviews don't need to be, and historically have not been, as divided as they are. Like that is a symptom of modernity that is very separate and different from the way that humanity, like science and religion, in the past were almost the same thing. And I think that we're getting back to a place where maybe we can recognize that they're more related than we thought. And so, I think just talking about that, I think talking too about, something that was so revelatory for me with Diana Pasulka's work was just understanding that, like, as much as it might make people uncomfortable, what's happening right now in like the UFO community and experiencer communities and that sort of thing, it is this is what the beginning of a religion looks like. This is how religions emerge. It's groups of people who find themselves kind of like turned on and on fire for like this particular idea about what lies beyond this world. Many of whom claim to have had like really anomalous experiences or contact with gods or beings or angels or deities or like whatever you want to call that. And that our response to it is predictable.
Yeah.
That the ways in which humans respond to the numinous and the unknown and the divine has a pattern to it. I always think about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Like the first time I ever went there, and I was driving around with this guy who, I never really checked this, but he claimed to have been a psychiatrist at Wright-Pat who had talked to a lot of people there whose lives got screwed up by what they saw. And we were talking about Wright-Pat, and I was like, gosh, it's very like short and squat. Like it's not very tall. And he's like, oh, but most of it's underground. And he's like, it goes down just like levels and levels, and there's all kinds of stuff underground at Wright-Pat. And I was like, it made me think of the Temple Mount. It made me think of like, this thing where, like, in some ways, like obviously Wright-Patterson was built where the Wright brothers, did their first like experimentation with flight and that sort of thing. It was the home of Project Blue Book, allegedly where the Roswell materials went. It's now like Space Force and like all of these things. So in a way, like this is like a holy site that has been the place where humanity has been kind of making its way to the stars. And the behavior that you see there is very similar to what you would see at like the Temple Mount, where there's, there have been many, many revelations and things that have happened there over millennia, and it's been rebuilt and rebuilt, and whatever incarnation it's in, there's always this like inner sanctum, this holy of holies, this place where like average people are not able to go that contain this like secret, right? Like
Yeah,
that's just one example, but I think that there's a real connection between that, and the way that we can keep that from getting out of control is by like being aware of it. And
sure.
not it's not always a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing to be religious, but I think that we can be dogmatic scientifically, we can be dogmatic religiously, and that's the thing that we should look out for.
Exactly right. And that's the part that people are most often complaining about when they're complaining about religions. It's like the insistence that your view is right and everyone else is wrong. It's not necessarily, the belief or the faith or whatever else that's um, the problem. It's fascinating to watch these discussions unfold. I mean, like even having Carl Nell and Diana Pasulka on with Jesse Michaels recently, they were talking about angels and demons and whatnot, and like some people got really hung up on the words that were being used and kind of feared that this was getting pushed into a kind of Christian direction. Um, and to me, a lot of it just it's the limitation of labels that we use, right? And like a lot of the approaches that we seem to think are conflicted are just a matter of how we're talking about various things. Like I remember that had an exchange on Twitter at one point about New Science of Heaven, Robert Temple's book, and he talks about plasma and the
Yeah.
plasma bodies and the Kordylewski clouds and how they may be some sort of superintelligence. I was really intrigued by that. I remain really intrigued by that, and it provides a mechanism for what may be kind of the spirit or the technology of spirit, right? Like maybe we are sort of hosts for these plasma beings that could be our spiritual bodies or whatever. And if that's the case, then suddenly we have merged science and religion, because the things that were exclusively the realm of religion suddenly somehow become more objectively real for scientific measurement or whatever else, and then the whole bifurcation kind of collapses. And like you said, I think that that's the place that we um, are trending. I think that we've seen that a lot with like quantum physics and the how it seems to align more and more with like the Vedas and sort of the ancient mystical approaches. And I mean, it's all human knowledge, and it's all about trying to explain our origin and purpose. And so, yeah, they're more alike, I think, than different.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned you guys were talking about the protocols during the show. Can you talk about your experience with those and what exactly that you did and what you thought of the results?
Yeah, so I did take a class from Diana. I think she still offers it from time to time, but it's on the protocols, and specifically these are the protocols that Tyler, who's pseudonymous, you can definitely figure out who that is if you Google it, but I will not say his name. Um, he's and he does these protocols basically that help him channel information from what he believes are off-world intelligences. And he is a mission controller for NASA, and he is also like a very rich guy in biotech. I'm not sure if he's a millionaire or billionaire, but he's got some cash.
A lot of
And
success with that, inventions of stuff from biotechnology, right?
yes, which is what's so
Yeah,
it's like one thing to say like I got a download, and it's another thing to
yeah.
like turn it into completely novel uh inventions that can fix people's lives. Like
Which is what intrigued me about Diana Pasulka's work to begin with, is that all these brilliant people were having this veridical information, and I was like, something's got to be going on there, but go ahead.
yeah, absolutely. And so I took the class, and the protocols are on one level really simple. They're just like you got to drink a lot of water. Tyler, he sleeps I think 8 hours a night and then does 8 plus 1. Like he'll wake up after 8 hours, and I think like drink a bunch of water and then like go back to sleep for another hour. You have to like basically work out to like the point where you're sweating at least once a day, eating very clean, no caffeine, no alcohol, no drugs. I mean, it sounds easy, right? Until you just try to
Oh,
like live your life in
the caffeine part, I'm like, oh my God.
the caffeine. It gets a lot of people. That one's really, really hard.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe the hardest. And so I took the class and I started doing those things. I also started doing things like, you know, blessing my water, things that sound that it, to younger version of me would have sounded absolutely insane. But there have been studies done that show that like the um, that water has a more coherent structure after it's been blessed. Like
Hmm?
if you freeze it, those crystals are more coherent.
Aligned, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Positive intention will make it more orderly. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So I don't know what that does for my body, but I do. I think in terms of, I'm having it be a part of a meditation about alignment and coherence and that sort of thing. And I did that with a bunch of other people, and it was life changing. I think that I'm someone who it's only in the last couple of years that I've been able to like have the language for this and then even admit it. But like I've always gotten downloads and kind of information that comes to me that's like fully outside of anything that I know, but that comes to me kind of fully formed and coherent and with a real purpose and happens like very quickly and there's like a feeling to it. And when I'm doing the protocols, it's happening all the time. In fact, to be honest with you, I don't do them very often. Like if I'm at a place where like I really need to have a breakthrough or I'm not sure what my next step is or I'm really stuck with writing a piece, I will switch into doing the protocols, but like doing it all the time is it can be tough. Like it feels for me at least, I feel a little too raw having all that information coming in all the time and it does feel like being in contact with something else. And I think that it made me completely think differently about creativity and what creativity is and how
Hmm.
that works. And I would say that like I have gotten to a place where I see creativity as contact because there's a certain point in a project, I think especially in a collaborative project with other people, where the
Hmm.
thing takes on a life of its own and it becomes more than the sum of its parts.
Hyperobjects.
And yeah, yeah. And I
Kind
think
of.
that's just the
Yeah.
coolest thing ever.
Yeah. Totally. That's intriguing and it's something I'm going to have to explore. Like the caffeine bit, man. If I don't get a caffeine hit in the morning, I have a headache by noon. So
It's
that's something
brutal.
I'll have to work on.
Yeah.
But I think that that's more toward the work that you're talking about, where it's like if people are doing that and they start to have these experiences that answer the question, is there anything else out there? I mean, whether you don't have to define it, you don't have to necessarily link it with aliens or spirits or anything else, but there's a presence there that you can, reliably connect with, then it answers a lot of those ontological questions about are we alone? And it takes all the power away from the gatekeepers. And I think that that's a fantastic way to approach all of this. So yeah. Let's see what else I got. You've been doing these AMAs, which are just mind-blowing. I didn't catch the most recent one. Can you give us some top line information that you thought was the most intriguing out of what you heard from? It was Gary Halputoff, Leslie Kane, and who did I miss?
Jim Segala.
Jim Segala. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Who I really appreciate. So I didn't mean that to be, I just forgot his name.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, well, I should give credit where credit's due. The live streams themselves of the AMAs have been set up by kind of the five of the bigger like UFO groups on subreddits on Reddit. So there's aliens, our experiencers, our high strangeness, our UFOB, and our UFOs. Like all those mods came together and they're making these. They asked me to host, but all the questions are sourced from members of those communities. It's like their typical AMA format, except that at the end, instead of just them typing their answers, we all get together, we do a live stream. So the first one was with James Fox for the program, which was really cool, and had Lenval Logan and Kirk McConnell joined us for that one. And then this most recent one, like you said, had Hal Putoff, Leslie Kane, Jim Segala, and Gary Nolan. And
Yeah,
I mean, it's just an honor. Like, I mean,
yeah, I bet.
like they thank me for doing it, and I'm just like, what else was I going to do on a Saturday night that was going to be better than than sitting down with the four of them? Like that was wonderful. I mean, I think so much came out of it. I feel like, as much as we were talking before about, sort of the manufactured nature of the disclosure narrative and how frustrating it can be and you see people online like really railing against gatekeepers and I understand, like I deeply understand all of that. and resonate with it in a lot of ways. But when you talk to people who are actually involved, like those people that we just mentioned,
Hmm?
um, there's a nuance to it. There's a subtlety to it. There's a, they it feels a lot less like some giant conspiracy. It's people who are doing their best within the frameworks that they have to like move the ball forward. And when you listen to somebody, I think Gary Nolan's section was particularly um, useful and kind of full of wisdom about, how we should be approaching these things. How do we handle this stuff scientifically? He's an experiencer and he's somebody who's, has people in his family who are experiencers. And so like he's fully bought in on that side of it, but he's also um, very, very practical about the need for us to establish things scientifically. Like
Yeah.
he knows that these things are real from his own experience, but that doesn't cause him to cut any corners or to allow other people to cut corners on how we're going to actually establish this scientifically.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was to me was a really cool part of the conversation. And then obviously like Hal Puthoff doesn't do a ton of interviews anymore. And, I was
Yeah.
grateful to even get a chance to speak with him. So that was really cool.
Yeah. That's a life goal almost, with
Yes.
help it off. And yeah, yeah. You think that, I mean, one of the things that, I've noticed with like Leslie in the past and some of these other folks, not necessarily in that group, but, I mean, you mentioned a little bit earlier with this idea that there may be something coming in the future. The 2027 date is something that's been mentioned before. And then Leslie had said something sort of similar during her interview on the theory of everything. And I heard that you'd asked her that question later on about what she was referring to. But do you have any sense of what that's coming from? You also,
Yeah.
Jeremy Corbell, of course, recently comes out and saying that there's going to be this lie that's going to be approaching where there might be a ship coming at half the speed of light from somewhere, and it may be a false flag kind of thing. Are those two things necessarily related to your mind?
No,
Yeah.
great question. I mean, the whole thing is complicated, and I've been trying to get to the bottom of it for like basically since I started this. Like, what is that? And I have a few different theories, but I'll try to break it down without talking for an hour. So I think that there has been, particularly in the experiencer and like contactee channeling, like that community, there have been people who are very gifted in that way, who have for several years now been saying that like somewhere between 2025 and 2027 that there's going to be some like big event. And there doesn't seem to be there are pockets of like ideas about what that could be, but there's no like consensus on it. It could be anything from like a massive cataclysm of some kind to contact with some sort of, like NHI is making themselves known or something like that. So there's that. I think that part of that, as always happens, got a little bit co-opted by the intelligence community, and whether that was done to cover up something that they actually do know is coming, or whether that was done to just further muddy the waters. And I mean, if you're going to slow down a group of people who are like really moving some dangerous ideas forward, making them think that they're all going to die feels like a pretty good way to to slow people down,
That's
right?
effective messaging, yeah.
Yeah, like so I think there's something to that. It's not that I don't trust people. The thing is about experiencer communities is that if you go back, like if we strip this down and we take all the like kind of UFO context out of it, and we're just looking at like spiritual groups or experiencer groups, like people who throughout history were having these kinds of experiences or this kind of contact, um, however they interpreted it, like apocalyptic visions are just like a part of that. That's something that basically always happens. There's always this message of apocalypse. And I don't know why that is. I find that really, really fascinating that that is something that is always kind of bubbling under the surface.
Yeah.
Um, because it doesn't seem to always mean that there's actually a cataclysm coming, right? Like a lot of people have predicted the end of the world and it hasn't happened. So what is that? Is that like a group memory of some like past cataclysm that's hanging out in like the collective unconscious or whatever you want to call it is it some kind of, are we getting disinfoed by the phenomenon itself, which certainly also seems to happen? Like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah.
The 2036 thing has been really interesting because that's something that's only popped up recently and it hasn't been shared as publicly. And part of the reason I said it was because I wanted the people who've been saying it to know that I know.
Yeah.
And
See, I hadn't heard it. I mean, Jeremy talked about it like it was something that was going to be either upcoming or was starting to bubble to the surface. And I guess that's what your experience is.
yeah, because I've
Yeah.
heard of the spaceship coming to Earth in the context of 2036. And the way that I've heard about that is like they're very, and I apologize, I usually don't talk about stuff where I can't say what I mean. I felt
Yeah.
like in this position, like in this particular situation, I decided to say something. I may live to regret that, but but there are particular people, big names in the disclosure movement who have been spreading this idea that there is an alien spaceship coming at half the speed of light, which I think is like, for some reason, that detail always sticks out to me because it's like such a weird way to put it. It's such
Yeah.
a,
Yeah. Yeah. So
like,
particular,
yeah,
like, I
like, what does that
mean,
even mean? Like, like that is such a weird, that is such a strange way to put it, but that's coming at half the speed of light and it's going to come here in 2036. And I'm suspicious of that for a variety of reasons. I'm suspicious of it because the way that I see it being spread is certain people reaching out through a proxy, like through someone who's like known and close to them, right? Reaching out to people who are either like people who are like mainstream stream celebs who are showing interest or like rising influencers, people who I think they think can be useful to them. And then they reach out and they give them this information. And then this person who's like a proxy says, and so, big name, wants to talk to you. Let's set up a call. And like, and then they set up this call. And, I think that that's sort of like the beginning. To me, that looks like an op. Like, that's what that looks like to me. And
yeah.
I could be wrong about that. Like, I don't
Mhm.
know that there's not an alien spaceship coming here that's going to arrive in 2036. But the way that it's going about and the way that it's being used to like secretly like recruit people to a certain point of view, uh,
Mhm.
like that's very suspicious to me. And
Yeah.
equally suspicious to me is the fact that like whatever the UFO phenomenon is, it's here now. Like
Yeah.
it's not coming. I mean, I guess, people have brought up like the third body, like the three body problem and like this idea that
Sure.
they're like these scouts that are being sent like hundreds of years ahead of time. Like, maybe, but like I feel like it's very convenient that at this moment where we're getting ready to like potentially make some real breakthroughs in understanding what it is that we're dealing with here, that all of a sudden they're like, well, it's coming in
Yeah.
2036. It's like, no, it's here.
Yeah. Well, and it's just like one of those things. I mean, by advancing something like that, but then not giving any details or any way to substantiate it, it's like, what are we supposed to do with that? I mean, are we supposed to like hunker down and build fortifications and like sharpen our sticks? I mean, like, but if it's really, I mean, really happening, then we need to have a really broad and long-running conversation about what it might mean. Do we have any sense of intention? Like, just inviting certain people who you think are amenable to that kind of information and may deliver it in the kind of way you want seems like you said, like an op. It seems like a manipulation.
Well, and
And I
when
kind
you
of get
look
tired
in,
of that whole clicky nature of things anyway. You know what I mean? Like there is sort of a in-group, out-group dynamic that happens with some of the folks in the community, which is I think also detrimental. But yeah,
yeah, I
weird.
mean, and the other thing is like I've gotten really into over the last year learning about like mind control and that
Hmm.
sort of thing and like
Yeah,
like the ways that our government has developed that and what we know about it and what we know
like
about
even
mind
up to
control.
today, currently.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I want to hear
And
more.
and one of the best ways to one of the best ways and like I've been learning about mind control and also like IC techniques. Like how do they like ingratiate themselves to people? How do they get information out of people? And like one of the best ways to get somebody to trust you is to tell them a secret, right? So you
Yeah,
got that right out of the bat, like right out of the gate with that story, with that this scenario. You're telling somebody a secret, right? The second thing is that the secret is terrifying. Like the secret is very scary because if you want to change someone's beliefs, the best way to do it is to traumatize them first. Like trauma is a key part of breaking down somebody's sense of self and somebody's sense of reality. And so if you tell them a secret, now you're on the inside, especially for a lot of people who just like this is all they're like us. This is what they do all day, every day. It's like the thing that makes them wake up in the morning. And so
Yeah.
when you have somebody who's maybe been a hero to you or who's like a big name in the field, when you've been like working so hard and trying to help, to
Break
have that
through.
person,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, to have that person come to you and be like, I'm going to tell you this secret because I trust you. Like that in of itself, I think is really powerful. But then when you like add on this, like, and there's a threat, right? Like, I just, to me, listen, I could be accusing people who are just trying to do the right thing, but I don't think that's what's going on there. From everything I've seen, that particular situation to me looks like an op.
Jeremy seems utterly convinced it's a lie.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what he's basing that off of, but um, and his whole thing with the documentary thing that came out, I would be pissed too. I'm sorry, like if someone got credit for something that I had brought forward and didn't bother to correct the record about that having happened, and I was sitting right behind him as it was all unfolding, I mean, people give Jeremy a lot of shit, but I just find him really earnest,
I do too.
and yeah,
I think he's a
I
white
tend
hat.
to.
I think he's one of the true white hats in the movement, and I think I I have a lot of empathy for what he's been going through. Because also keep in mind, like in the weeks leading up to that hearing, he was talking about getting death threats and all sorts of things in the show. It seems like, even Lou Elizondo is telling him like, you're and so like what does that do to you? It destabilizes you entirely. And I think it also maybe convinces you that like you're really over the target, right?
Yeah. Which
So
is, and if they want to do that, then I mean, it's like it can be a manipulation either way. Like you said, a hall of cracked mirrors with a quicksand floor or whatever, right?
yes,
Like there's no way to navigate through that. It's
it's
insidious.
tough.
It's tough. Yeah. Well, so I mean, that's basically all I had for you. I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and talk about all your insights and expertise. What do you got coming up soon? I mean, is there anything you got brewing in the works for the next few months? I know you're going to be at Contact in the Desert. Anything else people
Yes.
should look forward to?
Yeah, I'm going to be at Contact in the Desert. I'll be at Archives of the Impossible. I don't know if I'll be on stage for that yet, but I will be there if people are coming. I love to connect with people there. We also have a ton of new uh, podcast content coming. I'm writing and recording, and we're actually building a larger team to kind of move things forward. So there will be a lot more regular podcast content coming. So for people who've been frustrated with me over the last year, I promise the year long wait is almost over. There's new stuff coming very soon.
But you've done a lot in that year, so if they're frustrated, they just need to, get on the Amazon and watch what you've been doing.
Yeah, I know. I hope people will. I hope people will. But yeah, I know listen, I get frustrated when my favorite podcasts don't post either, so I get it.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. Well, thank you very much, Kelly. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was great to be here.